Two for the price of one. So our original title for this paper is Artificial Intelligence, Economics, and Industrial Organization, which has the very convenient feature, if you put it down as an acronym, you get AIEIO. With a bot here and a bot there. Here they are. Anyway, so we want to give a very quick, since a lot of this has been covered already, very quick review of machine learning. What do you try to do? Predict labels as a function of features. The classical approach was to construct numerical features, and then the programmers came up with rules that they embodied in code. That's so old-fashioned and out of it now. The only thing to do is deep learning, where you can take the raw data and learn directly. You feed in the pixels from the images. You feed in the paired documents. And by the way, I should thank our friends in Canada because they produced all these paired documents in English and French, which is fed into the Google translation system. And transcription, voice and text. So it's kind of remarkable. You no longer have to program it. You don't have to explain it. You just show it the right thing. What does it require? Labeled images, labeled data, for example. Open images, there's 9.5 million images that have been labeled that you can access. A fun thing to do is to go to the Google Cloud API interface. It has a little place where you can drop a photo, and it will give you all the labels on that photo. So it's really quite fun to play around with. Hardware, my colleagues say that when we moved from CPUs to GPUs, we had an order of magnitude improvement. And when we moved from GPUs to TPUs, tensor processing units, we got another order of magnitude. So there's huge progress on the hardware side. On the software side, we now have TensorFlow, and there are several other packages out there that make open source packages that make machine learning much, much easier to do. A lot of the stuff that's published in the press, you see the cool things like Go and chess and this and that. If you want to see some of the actual applications, go to Kaggle, where they have these contests. There are about 200 of them there. They're paying real money, in some cases millions of dollars, for machine learning competitions, and it's quite interesting to look at. For example, home prices, where Zillow is paying $1 million for parties that can improve their home price forecasting system, traffic to Wikipedia pages, personalized medicine, taxi trip duration. You see lots of real business questions that have come up that people are paying for the answers for. And of course, as we've heard many times, these services both complement human activity and they also substitute for it. What's scarce in machine learning? Well, you have to have a data infrastructure, but it's not scarce these days because you can go to Amazon, you can go to Google, you can go to Microsoft, and for very low prices, get cloud computing infrastructure for collecting, manipulating, storing, retrieval things. There's always going to be a challenge of integrating your system with with whatever cloud service provider you're using. Their system integrators play a big role in doing that because that's by nature a customized activity. There isn't something that's necessarily easy to standardize there. Software is widely available, open source in the cloud, hardware easy to purchase. Expertise at the moment is scarce, but it's growing rapidly. If you look at computer science enrollments and particular machine learning specialization, it's quite rapid. And having this firm-specific or problem-specific labeled data is really key. How do you get it? How do you get that labeled data? Well, it can be a byproduct of operations. Sometimes people talk about digital exhaust. You can offer a service. So you think about something like Google 411, which was the directory information service. When we started out doing voice recognition, we had no expertise and no data. First thing we did is we acquired the expertise, and then with the expertise, they developed this Google 411, which gave you phone numbers, and you called up, you said, I want Joe's Pizza on University Avenue in Palo Alto, and it would say, do you mean John's Pizza on University Avenue in Mountain View? No, I mean Joe's Pizza on University Avenue. And so eventually it would get it right, and there was a labeled point. So that was a good thing to be able to to get that data, and the system learned very, very rapidly. Or Flickr, you could say, show me a picture of a horse. You get a bunch of pictures, you click on a horse, well, you're labeling the data in that case, in that example. So there's lots of things like that where you can offer a service with the goal of collecting data. You can hire humans to label data. You can hire them in India and the Philippines and the US. There's all sorts of ways to do that. They're pretty standardized price sets. Buy it from a provider, maybe sharing data either by a group organization or mandated sharing of data from governments or consortia. And it's important, I mentioned this earlier yesterday, you shouldn't really think of data ownership, in my view. What you should think of is data control, because data is a non-rival good. All of us can have access to data at the same time. It's partially excludable, copyright and intellectual property things, but really it's the contract that does it. If I control some data, I collect some data, I can write a contract to license that to you. I don't need any government intervention to do that. That's just a private transaction that's enforced by the courts, and that's the way it mostly works these days. If there's somebody who has the data, they offer it to you, there's contractual terms, and you may or may not accept. Right now, for example, there's a debate in Europe about who should control driverless car data, and the German auto companies have written a 15-page white paper to argue that it's only the manufacturer that should have access to data from driverless cars, because other people would just mess it up, so only the driverless car manufacturer should have the access to the data. Does access to data give incumbents a major competitive advantage? Well, opinions differ on this, and if you look at something like somebody says, I want to get into the car business, I want to build cars, I really love cars. Trouble is, I don't know anything about it. Is that a barrier to entry? Yeah. You have to ask yourself, well, what is it that you expect? You should have some expertise, some knowledge, some information, some data, or some way to acquire it. And of course, it might come from the pieces I mentioned earlier, it might come from somewhere else. But what exactly should you think of in terms of offering a competitive advantage? Incumbents also learn how to improve the algorithms and business processes. Domain knowledge is important. There's a lot of debate about essential facilities. Of course, if multiple parties can have access to the same data at once, but a data provider or a data controller may restrict that access, what kind of rules do you want in that activity? Yeah, sure.
Say that because we should not count on antitrust in the United States, at least, to mandate access to data, even if it seems like a critical input that other people can't get. In Europe, there's more of a possibility for the law to do that. So if we're going to have the public policies in that area, we're going to need specific regulations or legislation in the US, whether it's for health or safety reasons. We have very little mandated data sharing in the United States, at least. And so that'll be an ongoing issue. But it's not as though we could just do that with existing antitrust law. Essentially not possible, with very limited exceptions.
Right, and I would say if you look at the driverless cars as an example, it's quite obvious, I think, they will be regulated. There will be some kind of mandated data interchange for public policy reasons. I've often said that we would have driverless cars today if it weren't for those pesky humans, because the driverless cars could easily coordinate among themselves, exchange data using standard protocols and so on, and that would give you something that would work far better than what we have now. If we could get rid of the pedestrians, it would be even better, and just leave the cars on the road to handle the driving. There's a lot of discussion. I heard yesterday somebody said that there was increasing returns to data. I've never seen an example of increasing returns to data. So if you have one, show it to me. This chart up in the left, this is the number of training images for the Stanford dog competition, where they have about 200 photos of 145 breeds of dog, and you're supposed to recognize what breed it is, and that data set has been worked over a lot, and you get perfect decreasing returns to scale. I mean, it's just exactly what you would expect to see. This is another chart I pulled off the web of looking, this was at detecting bosons, looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so, 6, I guess, different mechanisms, and they all have strong decreasing returns to data. That's the norm. So in the case of statistical case, you can prove it if you build a little model, but empirically it seems to hold for everything. And there's my slide that says my time has come, but don't worry, I'll be back.
I don't know who's the, I guess I'm the human in this case. I'm not sure. But we will change roles later. So I first want to just talk a little bit as an I/O person, sort of generally how I think I/O people, or at least I think about the questions here, overall, and how it fits in. First off, there's a lot of overlap with the way what I'm going to say and how I think about this with pieces we've already heard. The innovation paper, a lot about adoption. So I'm going to move into that very next, over who's going to adopt this technology at what pace. That's partly an I/O question. The productivity paradox paper, Eric and others, again, I think that's about the pace of adoption, and so that relates to who's doing it, organizational issues, some of the market design issues, particularly Steve, the part that you did, and then some of the stuff today certainly as well. Okay, I should also say, somewhat sheepishly, I think the income distribution stuff and the labor market stuff seems a lot bigger problem socially than concerns about monopoly power over, or market power over artificial intelligence. But I don't mean to demean I/O, I just want to put it in place. I think, in fact, but the framing is going to be, are there bottlenecks, monopoly control, that would slow down the adoption of this technology? So the predicate for that is, we want it to come faster, we don't want monopoly power to slow it down. Okay, now, so that's a starting point, and I think there is agreement around the table. This is overall welfare improving, that's good, but what are the distributional impacts? Okay. So first, what about adoption? So I think some of the questions that first come into mind. So which firms and industries are going to successfully adopt? And I think the key thing there to keep in mind is we know work by John Van Reenen, Bloom, others. There's enormous heterogeneity, even within an industry, about how firms, about their efficiency, their productivity, and their absorptive ability. Okay, so we're going to expect to see a lot of heterogeneity in this adoption of machine learning technology, just as we have for other technologies. And that's, of course, going to set up competitive dynamics. Who's going to be able to adopt quickly and who's not. One question naturally is, are the early adopters going to get a big advantage, or can others then imitate them? So it goes to some of the barriers to entry questions. We may see the geographic patterns and spillovers, okay, as well. And of course, the key I/O question, there's going to be a large competitive advantage to early adopters. Now, I think there's not going to be a simple answer to this across different markets. Okay, so let me give just 4 quick examples that I'll carry forward in my limited time. So General Electric makes large gas turbines. Okay, these are used for natural gas power plants. And they also make jet engines. It's a very similar technology. They are using, I work with GE, they are using AI deeply, machine learning deeply, to improve the operation of their turbines, to do maintenance. Okay, it's a big thing. Okay, they're kind of trying to turn themselves into an IT company in a lot of ways. Okay, that is probably going to, that's a very concentrated market. There are only a few firms that make these. I don't see how AI is going to open up somebody else to be able to do that better. Maybe, okay, maybe, you never know. But it seems like there's going to be competition among the existing players to do that better. And it'll stay as an oligopoly. So that's one type of structure. And we would hope they'd be able to do that efficiently and quickly to get better. Facebook, a second example. Okay, huge network effects. Lots of ways they're using machine learning. Again, we could imagine a disruptive entrant somehow doing some cool thing, but we can also imagine that's going to be very hard to displace Facebook, and they would copy, as they've already done, copy cool things that other people do. Okay, so again, it seems to benefit the incumbents in a way that's also pro-competitive, mind you, but not necessarily open things up. Uber would be the other type of example, where it's a disruptive entrant, huge benefits, and they are maybe not so much machine learning, but they'll use that and other similar technologies. My fourth example would be health insurance markets. United Health, huge amounts of information processing. They can benefit a lot from machine learning. They are doing so, but I would expect that to be a sector where it's going to be somewhat more sluggish, organizational challenges to do this, data issues as well. But again, I don't see there, it's going to have some new health insurance companies going to spring up. It could happen again. I don't see quite how that's going to happen. Maybe I don't have enough imagination. Okay, but there are a lot of other obstacles in health insurance, maybe not as much as in large gas turbines, for a new player to come in. Okay, So that's one thing, the adoption. I thought we have a little evidence on AI adoption. There's a nice McKinsey Global Institute survey. Their shtick is they're very well connected with big companies and chief executives and top executives. So they do surveys. I like their work very often, and here they've got this survey, and they're basically showing that a lot of these top executives, again, large companies, but across a number of countries, they're basically saying some of them, more in the tech industries, are adopting. A lot of them are like, my organization doesn't know how to do this yet. Okay, you hear that a lot. Well, they hear it a lot. Okay, I'm just picking up from what they're saying. So I think organizational inertia is going to be pretty significant. I doubt you'll be able to read this, but they have data on, this is by sector. So the top ones here in terms of how many AI components have they adopted in their organization is higher in telecommunications, high tech, energy, and it's lower in somewhat more fragmented industries. Maybe consumer goods here, construction, professional services. Thank you. Okay. All right. So the other then set of, besides adoption, I think a key question has to do with vertical integration. Is this going to happen within or across corporate boundaries? Okay, and that's going to affect, if there are going to be bottlenecks of market power, where will it be? So, how will the data and the tools be combined? Okay, and will machine learning users develop their own capabilities or purchase them? So basically a lot of make versus buy decisions that I think if you start to want to analyze industry effects, you need to sort that through. And we are seeing a lot of one-stop shopping in the cloud so far, and Hal was mentioning this too. A lot of these activities can be purchased, okay? And what seems like the thing that's harder to purchase, and Hal and I don't entirely agree on this, I think, is some of the data that's specific to the application, okay? But a lot of the processing power, the algorithms look like they're going to be markets for those. And then what is the public policy questions associated with that? Well, we talked about privacy yesterday some. So privacy rules may limit the ability to share data or buy and sell data. We can have some mandated data sharing, but again, I think that's going to be pretty limited unless we have new legislation. Okay, maybe something will come, but right now with the existing legal regime in the US especially, not much of that. And that could affect vertical disintegration as well if there were mandated data sharing. But if not, we'll probably see firms with data developing the capabilities to analyze that data in-house and purchasing a lot of the services as well from the cloud or elsewhere. Okay.
I told you I'd be back. All right.
A man of his word.
Yeah. So, and this expands on what Carl was just saying. The machine learning vendors offer several services. So you've got the data centers, and people often talk about lock-in and switching costs. There's a nice technology called containers and Dockers that allow you to basically pick up your application from one provider, like Google, and move it directly to Amazon or any other provider for that matter. And that's commonly used in the industry these days. Will the industry become more fragmented? I think what's going to end up is providing a bundle of solutions, because just as they don't know how to get started in many of these companies, they don't know how to get the labeling services, they don't know how to get the pipeline set up from the data collection to the cloud, all these things you really need to provide one-stop service, and I think that's where we're going to see a lot of activity. That previous chart was repeated. I wanted to return to this issue about data, the role that data plays, the way that hardware and software plays. This is the ImageNet error rates. It's the same chart as we saw before from Eric. And what's interesting about it is in the ImageNet competitions, the data size was held constant, okay? Because they wanted to see how things were improving, and there was no variation in the data size for the training data or the test data, at least the part that was used in the competition. They could have used data outside, of course, to build systems. Within the competition, data size was held constant. So this is all due to improvements in the algorithms, in the expertise, and in the hardware, all right? So it's a pretty big improvement, even holding data size fixed. Pricing of services. This is interesting because there's a big fixed cost in creating this environment, the hardware, the software, the expertise, everything else, but a very, very low marginal cost. So there's certainly a problem, potential problem with Bertrand competition, where you've got intense competition because of the low marginal cost after you've already expended these fixed costs, and how exactly that works itself out is going to be quite interesting to watch. I already mentioned the containers and Dockers and customer switcher costs. Learning by doing multi-product. Yeah, here's a shot from image API, and basically, if you look through this label detection, text detection, safe search, et cetera, it's about 1/10 of a cent an image. So if you want to say, here's an image, give me your guess as to what the label is, it costs you 1/10 of a cent to do that. Okay? Here's the Amazon Web Services. Well, guess what? It costs you 1/10 of a cent to do image recognition on Amazon, and I bet you anything that it's 1/10 of a cent to do it on Microsoft as well. You're seeing very intense competition among these providers. And now, the last handoff here.
The vendors, and that is oligopolistic so far in terms of some of these cloud services, but seems pretty competitive. We'll see where that goes. In terms of the user level, people who are purchasing the machine learning, the quick point there will be, I think a key question is, how will the advent of machine learning affect the minimum efficient scale for users? Okay, and I think it's unclear. It's going to be empirical question, probably vary by industry. You could see machine learning as transforming some variable cost, that's labor cost, into a fixed cost. Adopting this technology, fixed cost. So you might think that would increase the minimum efficient scale. But if machine learning is really, really cheap, it's not really a problem. Okay. So I don't think we know the answer to that yet. There is a whole view that you can, as a startup now, it's really easy to be a startup, right? Because you can buy all this stuff, including these machine learning and certain types of data. So that would be kind of lowering entry barriers story. I don't know the answer to that, okay? Whether it's going to affect on minimum efficient scale. Then just two other topics I will just flag and then stop. One is, how will people use machine learning for pricing and to engage in more sophisticated price discrimination? I think we know a lot about price discrimination. We've seen that happen with information technology already. It'll probably go in some weird, more dramatic direction, but I'm not sure it's a qualitative change. Okay, but it'll be an interesting set of questions. And then another thing that's like people are loving to talk about in I/O these days in antitrust is algorithmic collusion. What if you set your pricing to your bot or to your AI, and I do too, and we're competing against each other? Are they going to figure out a way to collude? Repeated games. And if so, is it illegal? And if it's illegal, who do we put in jail? Okay. All right. That's it.
The bot.
The programmer. Yeah. That's one answer by the person who programmed it.
Okay. Thank you, Carl.
So I had got the task of discussing Hal and Carl's slides. And I had some uncertainty even going to the finish line about what exactly set of topics they were going to discuss. So I put the standard major themes here. These were the themes that I was pretty sure they were going to discuss. And so what are the themes? Owners of scarce skills and assets that are, do we need to think about owners of scarce skills and assets that are destined for dominance, right? Is there a antitrust issue around that, especially around potentially the ownership of data? So I'll say a little bit about that. The impact of machine learning on vertical market structure. Should we think about returns to scale being increased or decreased? So what do we predict markets are going to look like? And then these last two things that Carl glided over, but maybe I'll spend a little more time on, is machine learning as a price discrimination tool, and also algorithmic collusion. And since Carl kind of made it sound like algorithmic collusion is a super fun thing for us to think about, which isn't very important. But as we're being replaced by machines, my understanding is we're supposed to just be spending our time on super fun things. Anyway, so good. Carl made this point, and let me put an even finer point on this, because in some of the discussion, some of the conversation yesterday, I feel like there was a little bit of maybe wading into what I would call a dangerous territory, right? So we've talked about a lot of things that AI makes us worried about, right? It makes us worry about labor market dislocation, rising inequality, rebellion against capitalism, rogue rogue Roombas murdering us in our sleep, dystopia, right? We've talked about a lot of things, and now I'm going to be talking about deadweight loss triangles, right? And we give up deadweight loss triangles all the time, right? So there is an issue of relative importance here, but I think the thing you don't want to do, which I think there is sometimes a temptation to do, is to think that antitrust is somehow a hammer that you want to use on the inequality nail, right? And so inequality is an important problem. There are a lot of public policy solutions to inequality. I'm pretty sure that antitrust is actually, it's true that antitrust has implications for consumers, but first order, antitrust is not going to be a major tool for dealing with these other large problems that we've talked about today. Okay. So, when we and I think there is a framing here in thinking about the competition policy questions, right? Is that we're thinking about the adoption of technologies which are going to radically decrease the cost of production, right? And so when we think about the consumer part, the things we should be worried about is there any antitrust type or market power type issue that's going to slow adoption? And then maybe secondarily, is there some barrier to consumers eventually getting the benefits from these improvements as cheaply as they can? Okay, so static versus dynamic efficiency, and Carl mentioned a little bit of this, but let me again highlight it. We are worried about market power, and we should be worried about market power, and we're worried about situations in which someone sets themselves up as a toll taker who can slow implementation or adoption of artificial intelligence by other actors. I think a thing we shouldn't be too worried about is ex post market power that arises from firms creating assets that then become important, right? So if we invest in data, maybe that data is going to become so valuable that down the road we may think that data is an essential facility, but I don't know that we want to do so much about that ex ante, because ex ante, we know that if we improve appropriability, on average, we're probably going to improve the speed of adoption, right? So there are some antitrust issues that we kind of know ex ante may occur ex post, but I think we should be cautious about how much we want to actually be thinking about them ex ante. Okay, so data. So I think Carl already raised this issue that I didn't quite know he was going to raise, which is, essential facilities is a very klutzy doctrine for dealing with creating data sharing, right? Essential facilities doctrine has barely been applied for information goods. There's like one case. There is some, in IP law, a movement, at least in the patent law, away from allowing firms who have intellectual property rights to get injunctions, right? So we're moving somewhat closer to almost like a mandatory licensing regime. But again, those are slow, ex post, later, protracted kind of ways to create, under the current legal environment, those are slow, ex post, protracted ways to get data sharing. So if there's a role for government, a role for government could be in the creation or, funding of data sets that have public good characteristics, right? And so I'm not sure now it's completely obvious which agencies have tasked themselves with, if there's a public policy argument for a data set being created that has the potential to spawn a lot of innovation, has public good characteristics, we should find ways to fund it. I don't know that system is so smooth, at least in the United States, and that is if this data could potentially have a public good characteristic, that is a potential role for government. I think it's a role for government that we should be talking about a little more. I'm going to skip this because I think Carl mostly talked about that. 2 minutes, yeah. Okay, let me say one quick thing about price discrimination. So Carl said that, one thing you would think about is that machine learning, artificial intelligence create massive potential price discrimination opportunities. I think there's an interesting question here about the horse race between price discrimination technologies and technologies which improve procurers and consumers' search and ability to kind of compare products, right? So, I think that, for example, the early days of the internet, a lot of people thought, oh, everything will be perfect competition because we'll have these, price comparison engines. And these price comparison engines help you compare two products with the identical SKU. With image recognition and smarter systems, procurement or consumer search over, competitive products should get better as long as someone has the economic incentives to provide those services. Places where I am worried about the role of consumer information affecting the market is I'm kind of worried about a world in which our ability to predict poor outcomes or insurable events, our ability to predict insurable events expands faster than our ability to prevent. So everybody can predict which consumers are going to default on a loan or are going to whose houses are going to burn down, but we haven't figured out how to not make their house burn down. So I'm a little worried about the effect in general on the insurance market, and that's a place for consumer information, but I'm less worried about price discrimination. And then I've got 1 minute, so let me talk about algorithmic collusion, because why not? In their slides, they made a point that machine-facilitated collusion has been around for a while, but probably not the part where the machines actually, teach themselves how to collude. I actually think, there's a lot of interest in this in I/O for reasons you can think. It's just intellectually kind of fun. I think there's kind of some interesting questions about whether computers are more or less likely to collude than humans are. Right, so there's some experimental research around how much people collude. If you let people actually talk to each other, they collude a lot. They don't seem to tacitly collude very well, or very much. But I think a lot of collusion could be sustained by failure of people to backward induct, and some collusion can be sustained by humans with their human emotions are able to make punishment regimes more credible than the punishment would actually be rational in the actual competitive environment. So it's not completely obvious to me that computers setting prices would collude more than human beings setting prices. They might collude more, and it's certainly theoretically possible that they can collude, but it's not completely clear to me whether they would collude more or less. Super fun question that we can spend some more time on when the computers have left us nothing else to do.
Okay, great. Thank you, Judy. We'll begin with Eric and then Chad.
Lots of interesting issues here. Let me zoom in on one, which is the data ownership and whether data is a scarce resource and whether there's a role for public policy there. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit about the debate over mobile phone number portability, that cell phone companies said it was technically impossible to move a phone from one company to another. It's just much too hard. And of course, once the law was passed, they found out, oh yeah, actually we can do that. But there are reasons that companies may not want to make it easy for competitors to have access to the same thing. And it'd be interesting to have Carl and Hal say a little bit more about maybe Judy's proposal that there are some public goods information that should be publicly provided, or some other ways that might force sharing if we think that the private incentives for sharing are not the socially optimal ones.
Chad and then Ben.
So I think the framing of I/O's ability to study AI as being mostly about antitrust is too narrow. I don't think it's just about triangles. I think I/O is really good at rectangles too, and rectangles are a big deal, I think, with the fundamental heterogeneity across firms and adoption. Even in a world where it's completely efficient for a market like this to turn into one giant firm runs the entire market, we still want to know that, want to think about the implications of how that changes the way things are made, how people get compensated. I agree with Judy, we don't want to use antitrust law as a cudgel to sort of fix the distributional effects of that, but I just want to, broaden the thing beyond just thinking about antitrust implications. And then on a specific point that was brought up several times about sort of this one-stop shopping and what it means for entry costs. And one thing that's useful to keep in mind is entry rates have been falling for 30 years now, and maybe this stuff just isn't big enough to matter yet, or maybe it's happening and that's still being swamped by these other forces that are bringing entry rates down, or maybe this will eventually turn things around. But I think it's just useful to keep in mind the data, which is entry rates are falling across sectors, and we really don't know why.
Ben, followed by April.
My point is actually very similar to Chad's second point, but let me take it one step further, which is thinking about another theme today, particularly about inequality and political economy implications. I mean, so if we see now, there's of course cross currents in this literature on dynamism and entry. Maybe like based on the presentation we saw yesterday at lunch, entry at high tech might just be fine. But if e-tail has replaced retail, mom and pop retail, for example, and if Amazon has a market power advantage, maybe via continual business process innovations because of machine learning and or experimentation on their very large platform. But imagine that it's very hard now for someone to start a mom and pop bookstore or whatever else you want to buy, hardware store, whatever that is, or just the IT advantage of Whole Foods, and now Amazon owns Whole Foods, over a local grocery. We think about, generally we've talked a lot about sort of lower income workers getting hurt because of factor price issues. But another dimension is the inability to be your own boss. And I often wonder if a lot of the anger that we sort of see politically today among lower skilled workers is not just about wages. What about autonomy? What about the fact that maybe it was more fun to build something with your hands or run your own shop than it is to stock shelves at Walmart or work for a big company? And if that's what's going on, I mean, it's not exactly antitrust in the ordinary way, but it might have very strong implications for general social well-being in a way that could, of course, spoil the party in the way that people seem angry today in America and otherwise.
Thanks, Ben. April, followed by Steve Fidelis.
Hi. So I just want to push a little bit on this idea of ownership versus control of data and how to think about that. I think we have other areas that we can look at something similar. So the genome, human genes are not patentable, and at least in the US. And this is a very similar thing. These are naturally occurring, just like the data is going to be naturally occurring. Now you might package it a little bit differently, but it is something there, and I think that this is going to be a big issue in this area.
Okay, thanks, April. Steve, followed by Ginger.
So on 3 points that were raised in both, and especially that Judy emphasized, one about the issue of antitrust as a social income distribution. Maureen Olhausen, is that how I pronounce your name right, on September 11th, just a couple of days ago, reaffirmed, this is from Bloomberg, her support of antitrust humility, quote unquote, amid public pressure for a more populist enforcement regime that reaches issues such as income and wealth inequality. And
Tell people who she is.
oh, sorry, she is the acting commissioner, acting chair of the FTC. And there really is a lot of push from many directions to become more like political activists through antitrust. On the issue of price discrimination, Hal and I were chatting about this because we were both interviewed for this article. There's an article that came out in The Atlantic a few months ago where the title was How Online Shopping Makes Suckers of Us All. I spent an hour with this reporter on the phone, and he just wanted me to say, oh yeah, first degree price discrimination, personalized pricing, that's where we're going to be next week. And no, we're not going to be there next week, and probably not in the next 10 years because of all the difficulties in doing that, many of which Judy raised. But there's this push, and reporters are going to write this. And last but not least, on the issue of algorithmic pricing, where I'm actually doing some work with Kayu Vikun on this, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called Virtual Competition, The Promise and Perils of the Algorithm-Driven Economy, written by a couple of lawyers who make the case, and this has been picked up in Europe, they've been eating this up, that, oh yes, these algorithms are going to collude and prices are going to go up. And when you look at the economic foundations, like you said, Judy, there's tons of research and experiments that show, no, this isn't that easy, and the human factor is critical. But politicians are just eating this stuff up. And as someone who only recently started getting into these competition policy issues, I think it's important for us to stand the ground that we need solid research and knowledge to understand where these things are going, and the populist views are really trying to take this in very different directions.
Thanks, Steve. Last comment, Ginger, and then Hal and Carl have a minute to reply.
I just want to make a comment about data sharing. All of you have talked about the potential public good feature of data sharing, whether government should subsidize centralized data sharing. These all imply that there is sort of too little data sharing now. And I want to put forward an argument saying that data sharing might already being too much. And here's the logic. A lot of data sharing in the data market are driven by the willingness to pay of the data purchaser. And those could be legitimate firms or non-legitimate firms. They could be that they see they can use this data to better price or design good product, and the value of that will be embodied in the price of the data. However, some negative consequence of that data sharing, for example, this could lead to identity theft or other things, are typically not easily incorporated in that price, because by the time the consumer observe a identity theft in their bank card, they don't know which path of the data sharing actually contribute to that. And because of that free riding problem, the negative externality could come to a conclusion that data sharing is too much. So I just want to put forward that argument in complement to what you had before.
Thank you. Yes, Carl?
Okay, great. Eric, I think your phone number portability example is good. It shows where we need a sector-specific regulator to put these things in place. I think we should think data sharing is easier when you're talking about interfaces or maybe standardized data protocols or fields rather than necessarily all the data itself or simple data like that. Chad, I totally agree with you about rectangles are bigger than triangles. We learned that in geometry. Really, my point about adoption and heterogeneity is really similar to what you said. I think the declining business formation, it's probably not mostly about market power. There are fewer dry cleaners now setting up. It's probably about access to capital after the Great Recession, although it's a longer-term trend. And also the efficiency of larger companies that makes it hard to go after if you're a little guy. So that's, from a competition point of view, that's a plus, not a minus, but you'll get loss of autonomy, as Ben was talking about. In fact, that was part of the roots of antitrust originally, actually, and 100 years ago, was people feeling that they lost control. Okay. On the ownership, and the data is not, it's not about patents. Data is not patentable. I mean, you had maybe a special case where we dealt with the case on the DNA data, but it's really just about proprietary information and whether it has to be shared. So it's not about intellectual property even, really. It's about, people just keep it secret, and can somebody else get access to it. Algorithmic collusion. Steve, I know you're working on that hard for Amazon so they can do that. No, that's not what you said. The reason my slide, I didn't have much time on, and Judy added a lot of good stuff. I put in there, it's catnip for economists, and my point was, it is a lot of fun to talk about. I'm not sure it's a very big thing in the end. We'll talk about it. It'll be studied because it's so much fun. But open question whether it's really going to be much different than what we've seen. And Ginger, on your point, data sharing. So part of the problem is if you start mandating data sharing, then you have to say, well, exactly which data needs to be shared, and what are the terms on which it needs to be shared, and with whom does it need to be shared? And if I have to share my data with you, what are we going to do to make sure you keep it secure? Okay, so there's a lot of regulatory apparatus necessarily around any data sharing regime. That's why I think you can't expect the courts to do that. It would need to be some specialized entity that could handle those things if you want to go in that direction.
Yeah, actually, I'll say a word about number portability because I was actually consulting for one of the companies that was involved in this number portability debate. And we had a few conversations, and one Monday they called me up and said, well, we're not gonna pursue this. I said, why not? They said, well, there were 2 reviews that came out over the weekend, one in Consumer Reports and one in the New York Times that said we were the best provider. So we think number portability is okay now. It cuts both ways. That's the point. Starting a grocery store, starting a business, nobody guarantees success. It was like my example. I want to start manufacturing autos, but I have no knowledge, no information. No data is the least of my problems. It's a case where you have to say that's what competition is all about. You enter in, you try it. There should be no artificial entry barriers, but there certainly could be a lot of real entry barriers, namely not knowing what you're doing. Finally, on this algorithmic collusion, it is really interesting. I think the weight of economic research over the last several decades that we've looked at this issue of tacit collusion and this kind of stuff is it's not the sophistication of the players that's the problem, because the rules tend to be not very sophisticated. It's in fact the noise in the information channel. So how noisy is it in terms of, can I really understand whether you are holding up to our tacit collusion or not? Maybe it's only a tacit agreement and it's not worth the paper it's written on.